She answered a rancher's advertisement with 3 words that stopped him cold. "I have nothing." He hired her anyway. What he didn't know, what nobody in Blackstone Ridge knew, was that the quiet woman stepping off that dust-caked train was hiding a secret worth $340,000. Enough money to buy the entire county twice over. She had left a fortune behind to answer one question that had haunted her for years. Would any man ever choose her for who she was? And not what she owned? This is that story. Drop your city in the comments right now so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. Because what happens between these 2 people on that broken-down ranch in West Texas will stay with you long after this video ends. The advertisement cost Gideon Vance 43 cents and approximately 30 minutes of his dignity. He wrote it himself at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night in late September of 1879, with a kerosene lamp burning low and a whiskey glass he hadn't touched sitting 2 inches from his right hand. He'd poured it an hour earlier out of habit, the way a man does things alone long enough that habit becomes a kind of company. He hadn't drunk from it. He hadn't done a lot of things lately that he used to do automatically, back when there was someone else in the house who made the doing of things feel like it mattered. He picked up the pen twice and put it down twice before he finally just wrote the thing. Rancher, widower, 34, West Texas. 200 acres outside Blackstone Ridge, seeking woman for practical arrangement. No courtship. No promises beyond fair treatment, a warm house, and honest work. Must be capable, healthy, willing. Must not be attached to family elsewhere, expecting money, carrying complications of any kind. Reply to Box 7, Blackstone Ridge Post. He read it back once. It sounded like a livestock notice. He sent it anyway. The truth was, Gideon Vance had not been looking for a woman. He had been looking for a solution to a specific set of problems, and somewhere in the back of his exhausted mind, a woman had presented itself as the most efficient answer. His ranch hands quit in July when he couldn't make full payroll. His cattle count was down 30% from the summer drought. His account at Mercer's General had been frozen since August because he owed the store's owner, Dale Mercer, $87 he didn't have. The land itself, 200 acres of West Texas scrub that his late wife Clara had once called our little empire, with a completely straight face, was dry and cracked and looked increasingly like it was trying to return itself to the earth from which it came. He needed someone who could cook without complaining about the wood smoke, someone who could keep records, because Gideon's own bookkeeping was, by any honest measure, a disaster. Someone who could manage the household so he could focus entirely on keeping the cattle alive through another winter. He did not need love. He had already had love. Love was buried in the churchyard at the east edge of town under a stone marker that said Clara Ann Vance, beloved wife and mother, 1848 to 1876. The mother part was the cruelest detail. Their boy hadn't survived the fever either. He'd followed his mother into the ground 6 days later, 3 years old, in the March of that year. Gideon didn't talk about that. Not to anyone. Not ever. He needed a practical woman. Someone with nothing pulling her elsewhere. No mother fretting over letters, no father arriving unannounced to assess the situation, no money of her own to make her feel like she deserved something better than what this land could offer. A woman with nothing would be a woman who stayed. A woman who stayed would be a woman who worked. A woman who worked might just be the thing that kept this ranch alive long enough to matter. That was the logic, and Gideon was a man who respected logic above most things. He sealed the envelope, walked to the post office in the dark, and shoved it through the slot before he could change his mind. He received 11 replies over the following 3 weeks. 7 of them were immediately disqualifying. 3 came from women who mentioned fathers, brothers, or cousins within the first paragraph. 2 mentioned prior engagements ended badly, which Gideon read as complications pending. 1 woman included a daguerreotype in which she was standing in front of what appeared to be a very large house, and the dress she was wearing cost more than his last cattle sale. He set that one aside without finishing it. The remaining 4 he read more carefully. 2 were written in the kind of flowery, overwrought script that suggested women who had spent a great deal of time reading romantic novels and very little time doing anything practical. One described herself as spirited and fond of adventure, which Gideon translated as, "will complain about the mud." The other used the word companionship 4 times in 8 sentences, And while Gideon held nothing against companionship as a concept, the repetition made him nervous. The fourth letter was different. It was short. 3 paragraphs, clean handwriting, no flourishes, no declarations of character, no romantic language whatsoever. It stated her name, Evelyn Vale, her age, 28, her location at the time of writing, a boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, and her situation, no living family, no assets, no attachments. Then it said this: I understand the nature of what you're proposing, and I have no objection to it. I am capable of running a household, managing basic accounts, and working outdoors when necessary. I don't expect more than you've offered, and I won't ask for it. If the arrangement suits you after we've met, I'm prepared to proceed. That was it. No signature beyond the name, no plea, no performance. Gideon read it twice, then set it on top of the others where it stayed. He wrote back the following morning. The train from St. Louis arrived at Blackstone Ridge every Wednesday at 2:30 in the afternoon, assuming no delays, which there almost always were. Gideon arrived at the platform at 2 o'clock because arriving late felt rude in a way he couldn't entirely explain, even for an arrangement as stripped of sentiment as this one. He stood with his hat in his hands, which he only realized after about 5 minutes and felt foolish about, and put it back on his head. The train pulled in at 3:15. Passengers came off in the usual disorder. A family with too much luggage, a traveling salesman with a sample case, 2 ranch hands returning from somewhere they clearly shouldn't have gone by the looks on their faces, an elderly couple moving with the careful deliberateness of people who had recently been told to take it easy. And then her. He knew it was her before she turned around. It was something about the way she stopped on the platform step and didn't immediately look for someone. Most people stepping off a train in a strange town scanned the crowd first thing, looking for a face they recognized or a sign with their name. She didn't do that. She looked at the station itself, the warped wooden boards of the platform, the faded paint on the depot sign, the general condition of the street beyond, with the focused, assessing expression of someone taking inventory. When she finally turned toward the crowd, her eyes moved across it methodically and landed on him with no particular drama. She was tall. That was the first thing he registered. Tall and straight-backed, with dark hair pinned up under a plain traveling hat that had seen better decades. Her dress was clean but worn. She carried 1 bag, medium-sized, which she held herself without looking for help. She walked toward him directly. "Mr. Vance," she said. Not a question. "Miss Vale." He reached out and she shook his hand the way men shook hands. Firm, brief, done. "Thank you for coming to meet me." Seemed right to. She looked at him for a moment with those steady gray eyes that he would come to know as her default expression. Not cold exactly, but not warm either, just present in a way that most people weren't. Like she was actually there, in the moment, paying attention, rather than performing the act of paying attention the way most folks did. "Is there somewhere to eat before we go out to the ranch?" she asked. The dining car on that train was not worth the name. "There's a place on Main. It's not much." "I don't need much." They walked to May's in silence that Gideon kept waiting to become uncomfortable and never quite did. She ate a full plate of whatever May put in front of her without commenting on it, studied the street through the window while she ate, and asked him 2 questions. How far was the ranch? And what time did the household typically rise in the morning? He answered both. She nodded at both. They left. He drove the wagon. She sat beside him and watched the land open up around them as Blackstone Ridge fell behind. The scrub grass browning in the October chill, the flat horizon pressing down under a sky that was already suggesting winter. "It's dry," she said. "Has been." "How's your water source?" "2 wells, one's reliable. One's not what it used to be." She nodded slowly, like she was filing it away. "You said in your letter you have no family," he said. It came out more blunt than he intended. "That's correct." "No one expecting to hear from you?" "No one." He waited to see if she'd volunteer anything else. She didn't. The wagon wheels ground through the pale dust of the road, and the sun dropped another notch toward the horizon. "I'm not going to be, He stopped, tried again. "I want to be clear about what this is." "You were clear in your advertisement." "Yes, but Mr. Vance," her voice was even, not unkind. "I answered your advertisement because it was honest. You want someone to help you run a ranch, and you're not interested in pretending it's something else. I respect that. I'm not here looking for something you didn't offer. He didn't have anything to say to that, so he didn't say anything. They rode the rest of the way in silence again. The ranch appeared when the road curved around a low rise. The house first, weathered but solid, then the barn, then the far fence line running along what had once been a proper pasture and now was mostly cracked earth. She looked at all of it without flinching. "It's got good bones," she said. He wasn't sure if she meant the land or the house. Maybe both. "It used to be better," he said. She climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to help her and picked up her single bag from the back. "Most things that matter used to be something different," she said, and walked toward the front door. He had prepared the back bedroom. It had been a storage room for most of the last 3 years. Boxes of Clara's things he hadn't been able to sort through, spare tools, a broken rocking chair he kept meaning to repair. He'd cleared it out in the week before her arrival, moved in the spare bed frame from the barn, bought a new mattress from Mercer's on credit he couldn't afford, found a washstand in the corner of the main room that hadn't been used in years. It was clean, it was bare. It was nothing to be proud of. She walked through it, set her bag on the bed, and said, "Thank you. This is fine." He showed her where things were. The kitchen, the pantry, the wash basin, the outhouse, the well, the barn. She followed him through all of it with the same attentive silence, asking occasional practical questions. "Where do you keep the lamp oil? What time do you want supper? Are there any foods you can't eat?" He answered everything. He felt, in a strange way he didn't have a name for, like he was being cataloged. Around 7 in the evening, she went into the kitchen and made supper from what she found in the pantry. He heard her moving around in there, so not the clattering, fussing sounds he half expected, but a quiet, efficient choreography of small sounds. A knife on the board, the thump of a pot, the hiss of something hitting a hot pan. She brought 2 plates to the table without ceremony. He looked at what was on his plate. Salt pork, boiled potatoes, and something he couldn't immediately identify made from dried beans, onion, and what smelled like the last of his pepper. He took a bite. It was good. It was significantly better than anything he'd made himself in 3 years, which he'd known wouldn't be a high bar to clear, but still. He looked across the table at her. She was eating without looking at him, clearly not waiting for a compliment. "This is good," he said. "There wasn't much to work with." "I know. You're out of a lot of things. I'll make a list. I have a credit problem at Mercer's." She looked up. "How much?" $87. She looked back at her plate. "Is that the only debt?" He put down his fork. "Miss Vale, you've been here 4 hours." "I know. Is it the only debt?" A long pause. The lamp flickered. "No," he said. She nodded once and went back to eating. He picked up his fork again. Outside, the October wind came off the plains and shoved against the house with a sound like a man testing whether a door would hold. She was up before him every morning. He didn't know when she slept. The first morning he came downstairs at 5:30, she was already at the kitchen table with what appeared to be his ledger, the one he kept in the bottom drawer of his desk in the main room, the ledger he hadn't opened himself in the better part of 6 months because looking at it made him feel sick. It was open in front of her, and she had a piece of paper beside it on which she was writing. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She didn't look startled or caught out. She looked like she'd been waiting for him to get there. "I found your books, chum," she said. "I see that. When did you last reconcile these accounts?" "I don't—" He stopped, started again. "March, maybe?" "April. There's an entry in April, then nothing." She looked down at the ledger, then back at him. "You're being overcharged by Mercer." "What?" "He's been billing you 11 cents per pound on your dried goods. The county rate as of last year was 8 cents. The difference isn't large on any single purchase, but across 8 months it adds up." She turned the paper toward him. $31 and change. Gideon crossed the room and looked at the numbers she'd written out. Clean, organized, laid out in a column that made the pattern impossible to miss. "Dale Mercer wouldn't—" "Look at the dates," she pointed. "You started doing it in February, 2 months after you stopped coming in regularly." He stood over the paper for a long moment. His jaw was tight. "I'll need to see his pricing sheet to be certain," she said, "but I'm fairly certain." How do you know what the county rate is? She paused for just a moment. Not long, not even a full second, but he noticed it. I've done accounts before, she said, for various people. He looked at her. She was looking at the ledger again. Who? He said. People who needed them done. He decided not to push it. Not yet. She poured him a cup of coffee she'd already made and slid it across the table and went back to the numbers. He drank it standing up, watching her work, and tried to identify what it was exactly about her presence in his kitchen that felt so profoundly strange. After a while, he figured it out. It felt like the house was occupied again. Not just by another body, but by someone paying attention to it. He wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing. 3 days after she arrived, he found her at the north fence line before sunrise. He'd gone out to check on the cattle at first light and taken the long way around, and there she was on the ground beside the third post from the corner, using the small hand tools from the barn to reset a fence post that had been slowly failing since summer. Her hands were working steadily, driving the post setter with the flat side of a rock since the proper driver had gone missing some time back. He stood about 20 yards away and watched her for a moment. Her hands were bleeding. Small cuts from the wire she'd been working with, the kind of thin, stinging cuts you barely notice when you're doing a job, but you absolutely feel later. She hadn't stopped working. You shouldn't be, he started. This one was about to go completely, she said without looking up. If it goes, the cattle will push through the next two in short order. You'll lose the whole north boundary. He walked over, crouched down beside her. Let me. She moved back, but only to a better position to hand him things. She didn't retreat. She kept working alongside him, holding the post while he reset it properly, passing the wire when he needed it, twisting the brace at the right moment without being asked. They fixed the fence in about 40 minutes. He would have done it alone in an hour. When it was done, he looked at her hands. The cuts were worse up close. Come inside, I've got a tin of salve. I'm fine. Miss Vale. He said it firmly enough that she stopped. You're bleeding on the fence wire. She looked down at her hands like she'd genuinely forgotten. All right, she said. Back in the kitchen, he got the tin of salve from the medicine shelf, and she held her hands out across the table and let him apply it without making a production of it in either direction, neither protesting nor performing gratitude. He worked carefully, more carefully than he probably needed to, because the cuts were really quite small by ranch standards. You've done farm work before, he said. Some. Where? Another of those small pauses. Different places. He decided again not to push, but the pauses were adding up into a shape he couldn't quite see yet. He put the tin back on the shelf. She was already getting up to start breakfast. I noticed the tax records on your desk, she said back to him. Your property assessment is wrong. You're paying on 180 acres of prime grazing land, but at least 30 of those acres are rocky highland. The classification matters for the rate. He stared at the back of her head. How much would the difference be? He finally said. $12 to $15 a year. It would take a formal request to the county assessor, but it's a legitimate correction. She took down the pan from the hook above the stove. Do you want eggs this morning? She said. You have 6 left. He sat down at the table heavily, feeling slightly like the ground had shifted under him in some indefinable direction. Yes, he said. Eggs are fine. The town had opinions. It was a small place. Maybe 300 people inside the town limits, another few hundred scattered across the surrounding range. Small enough that an advertisement in the Frontier Companion matrimonial section, placed by a widowed rancher well enough known in those parts, would travel through the community inside of a week. Small enough that the arrival of a woman by train, alone, with one bag and a handshake where other women might have expected a bouquet, would be discussed in detail at the barbershop, the feed store, the church hall, and May's counter for the following several weeks. The opinions were various. Hank Rowell, whose ranch bordered Gideon's to the west, said he thought it was a practical decision and good on Gideon for making it. Hank had lost his own wife the previous spring and was widely expected to be sending off for a replacement inside the year, so his endorsement came with a certain self-interest. Nora Pruitt, who ran the boarding house and was therefore the central intelligence hub of Blackstone Ridge, said the woman seemed capable enough from what she'd seen, but there was something about her that didn't add up, and Nora Pruitt's ability to sense what didn't add up was an established local institution. Dale Mercer said nothing publicly, but his wife mentioned to two different women at the church social that she'd heard Gideon's mail-order woman had quite the manner about her for someone who'd arrived with nothing to her name. The wife put a particular stress on the word manner that communicated a complete paragraph of meaning to everyone who heard it. The Reverend Coleman, who Gideon didn't like and went to some trouble to avoid, said it was a shame a good man was reduced to ordering himself a wife like she was a piece of equipment, and this was reported back to Gideon within 48 hours because that was how small towns worked. Gideon heard all of this the way he heard most things that weren't directly his problem, at a distance, with minimal response. Evelyn heard none of it, or appeared to. She went to town twice in her first 2 weeks at the ranch, both times for practical reasons, both times alone. She spoke to people when they spoke to her, answered questions with precise brevity, and appeared to notice the assessments being made of her without being particularly troubled by them. The second time she went into town, she went directly to Mercer's General. Gideon didn't know she was going there until she came back. She set a handwritten note on the kitchen table in front of him. On it was a column of numbers with dates next to them. "I went and looked at his pricing ledger," she said. "He keeps it open on the counter for customers to check. Most people don't bother." "Evelyn," he stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She didn't react to it. "The overcharge is $34. I told him I'd noticed it." Gideon's stomach tightened. "What did he say?" "He said it was a clerical error." "Was he angry?" "He was something. I'm not sure I'd call it angry." She sat down across from him. "He said he'd take it off the tab." Gideon looked at the numbers, $34. It wasn't enough to change anything fundamental, but it wasn't nothing either. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "Not alone. Not with Mercer." "Why?" Because people in this town," he rubbed his face. "You've been here 2 weeks. You can't go walking into a man's business and accusing him of—" "I didn't accuse him of anything," she said, perfectly even. "I showed him the numbers. Numbers aren't accusations. They're just numbers." He looked at her across the table. "Dale Mercer is not a man who forgets things like that," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine he is." She got up and went to the stove, and that was apparently the end of the discussion. He sat at the table for another minute, the list of numbers in front of him, trying to figure out why he felt, simultaneously, grateful and deeply uneasy, and why those two feelings seemed to be feeding each other rather than canceling out. She had been at the ranch 6 weeks when Gideon understood that something had shifted in a direction he hadn't planned for. He didn't identify it for what it was, not then. He just noticed the specific quality of certain moments and tried not to examine them too closely. The way the kitchen felt different with two people in it. Not warmer, exactly. They weren't a warm pair, the two of them. Not given to casual conversation or easy laughter, but occupied. Present. The house had a different sound when she was in it, a different rhythm. Her footsteps in the hall at 6 in the morning. The particular sound of her setting a coffee cup down without slamming it. A courtesy he'd stopped expecting and then started noticing was always there. The evenings were the strangest. After supper, they both stayed at the table. He had ledgers or ranch business to work through. She had her own writing. She wrote letters, or what appeared to be letters, though she always turned the paper face down if she heard him coming, and he chose not to mention this. Sometimes she read paperback volumes she'd apparently brought in her single bag because he didn't own anything except a Bible and a worn copy of a cattle breeding manual. They talked sometimes, not about personal things, about the land, the cattle, practical matters, but occasionally a conversation drifted sideways into something else. She mentioned once that she had been in San Francisco before St. Louis, just in passing, and then let the information sit there without adding to it. Another time he said something about Clara's kitchen garden, the one that had gone wild and then gone dry in the years since, and she said she'd been thinking about whether the soil on the east side of the house was recoverable, and the conversation stayed on soil composition for a while before he realized they'd talked for over an hour. He thought about it later. An hour. He hadn't talked to anyone for an hour about anything in a long time. He was careful with himself about all of this. He was a man who had lost things before and knew the weight of that, and he was not interested in acquiring anything new to lose. The arrangement was what it was. She was a capable woman doing a practical job in a practical arrangement, and he was a rancher who needed the help. But November came down hard off the plains that year, and the house was small, and the fire needed two people to maintain it, and sometimes in the evenings the wind outside was so complete and so uninterested in the two of them sitting in the light of the lamp that it was almost impossible not to feel the specific warmth of another person in the room. Almost impossible. He managed. November's third week brought the first real crisis. He'd been watching the herd for signs of the cough that had moved through a neighboring operation in October, a respiratory illness that could take an animal down fast if it wasn't caught early, faster if it spread. He'd been watching and thought he'd been watching closely enough. He wasn't. He found 3 animals down in the lower pasture on a Wednesday morning, 2 more showing symptoms by afternoon. By evening, he had 7 animals sick, and the particular sick feeling in his own gut that came from watching an already thin margin of survival get thinner. He was in the barn until midnight, working by lamplight, doing what he could, which was not much. Cold compresses, separation from the herd, what he had on hand for fever. He sent a message to the veterinarian in Blackstone Ridge, who was reliable but 30 minutes away and already stretched thin across the county. At some point past 11, Evelyn appeared in the barn doorway with a lantern and 2 cups of something hot. "Coffee," she said, "or close to it." He took a cup. She set hers on the post beside her and looked at the animals. "How many?" she said. 7 down. 3 more I'm watching." She was quiet. Then she walked into the barn past him and began moving between the animals, checking each one with her hands in the quiet, methodical way she did everything. She wasn't a veterinarian, and he knew that, but she wasn't fumbling either. "This one's the worst," she said, crouching by the second animal. "I know. The lung sound is wrong. I know that too." She stood up. "The others can probably pull through with management. This one needs something more than you have here. Dr. Hale is coming in the morning." "All right." She looked at him. "You should go sleep for a few hours. I'll watch them." "That's not—" Gideon. Again, his first name, same as before. No announcement, just usage, the way you use a name when you've decided it's yours to use. "You've been in this barn since 6 this morning. You're not helping them by being exhausted. Go sleep for 3 hours. I'll wake you if anything changes." He was too tired to argue well. That was the truth of it. 3 hours, he said, 3 hours. He went inside. He set an alarm in his head the way ranchers did, internal and approximate. And he came back outside at what turned out to be closer to 4 hours later, feeling simultaneously worse and better than before. She was sitting on a hay bale between the 2 sickest animals, her lantern low, her book open in her lap but not being read. She'd been watching the animals the same way she watched everything, steadily, quietly, paying actual attention. 4 of the 7 recovered fully. 1 they lost regardless, a 4-year-old steer that had probably been compromised before the illness hit. 2 more recovered partially, well enough to survive, but not enough to be top stock. The loss was real, and it stung. But it was survivable, barely, in a way it wouldn't have been if the whole herd had been allowed to move through the illness unmanaged. Dr. Hale, when he came the next morning, looked at the condition of the animals and at the records Evelyn had kept through the night and said, "Whoever was watching these did a solid job." Gideon said, "My wife." He hadn't called her that before. The word just came out. Evelyn was across the barn and he didn't know if she'd heard it. He didn't take it back. By the end of November, the ranch's financial situation had shifted in ways Gideon couldn't entirely account for. Not dramatically. He was not suddenly solvent, not suddenly comfortable. The cattle loss had been a real blow, and the debt to the bank remained what it was. But the account at Mercer's was down, and the tax adjustment Evelyn had written up had been submitted to the county assessor and was pending response. And 3 separate invoicing errors with his 2 remaining suppliers had been identified and corrected, recovering a combined $30 he was owed and hadn't been collecting. He knew she was doing this. He could see the ledgers. He wasn't sure exactly how she was finding these things, the precision of it, the speed. But he'd stopped being surprised by her competence and moved on to a more complicated feeling he couldn't name. He asked her about it one evening. "Where did you learn accounts?" he said. "The real version, not the basic kind." She was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. "I studied for a time," she said, "with a man in Philadelphia who managed large estates. He needed someone to help with the calculations." "Philadelphia?" "Before San Francisco." He looked at her. "Philadelphia. San Francisco, St. Louis. All of those were a long way from each other, and all of them were a long way from Blackstone Ridge. He had, in some corner of his mind that he was still trying to keep carefully closed, begun assembling a map of her and finding that it had more territory on it than made sense for a woman who had arrived with a single bag and nothing else. "That's a lot of places," he said. "Yes. For someone with no family and no attachments. The fire. The wind." "I moved around," she said. "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. Something crossed her face. Not quite pain, not quite decision, something in between. "It was easier than staying," she said. He wanted to ask more. He could feel the question right there in his mouth, ready to go. He let it sit. Outside, the first real snow of winter had begun to fall, covering the cracked ground in a thin layer of white that made the whole ranch look, briefly, like something new. It arrived on the second Wednesday of December. Gideon picked up the mail on his monthly supply run to town. Feed, nails, 2 items for the kitchen. There were 4 letters in the box, 3 of them for him, business matters, and one addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize to Evelyn Whitmore Vale. He looked at the name for a long moment in the cold outside the post office. Whitmore, not Vale. Or Vale, but with a name before it he had never heard. The return address was a law firm in Boston, Massachusetts. The full name on the letterhead, from what he could see through the envelope, appeared to be something with associates at the end, and a name that meant nothing to him. He carried it home in his coat pocket. He put it on the kitchen table when he came in, without comment, and went to hang up his coat. When he came back, she was standing at the table looking at it. She hadn't touched it. She was just standing there, still in the way she got when she was managing something internal. "Letter for you," he said. Unnecessary, obvious. "Yes," she said. "From Boston." "I know." He waited. She didn't pick it up. "You going to open it?" She was quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "Not right now." He looked at the envelope, looked at her. "All right," he said, and went back outside to unload the rest of the supplies. That night, he saw her through the kitchen window before he came in. She was sitting at the table with the letter in front of her, unopened, just looking at it. She sat there for a long time. In the morning, the letter was gone from the table. He didn't know where she put it, and he didn't ask. But the name stayed in the back of his mind. Whitmore. Something with a name before it that meant nothing to him. But that felt in the way that small things sometimes felt, like a door he hadn't known was in the room. The name Whitmore sat in Gideon's mind the way a splinter sits in a finger, small enough to ignore most of the time, sharp enough to remind you it was there whenever you pressed on it. He pressed on it more than he should have. He didn't say anything. That was the thing about Gideon Vance. He was a man who had learned, through years of hard solitude and harder loss, that most questions were better held than asked. Claire used to say he was the most patient man she'd ever met, and she said it sometimes with admiration and sometimes with a frustration she tried to keep below the surface. He'd ask when he was ready, or when he had to. December settled over the ranch like it had decided to stay permanently. The second well dropped to nearly nothing, which he'd been expecting but not hoping for, and the cattle needed supplemental feed he hadn't fully budgeted for, and the letter from the county assessor came back saying the property reclassification request required additional documentation that Evelyn set about gathering with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. The days had a rhythm now that he'd stopped noticing as new and started simply living inside of, the way you stop noticing the walls of a room you've been in long enough. She was up first. Coffee was on when he came down. The books were never where he'd left them, but were always in a better order than he'd left them. Supper happened. The evenings happened. The fire and the wind and the 2 of them in the lamplight, not saying much, saying enough. It was a life. Whether it was his life or some temporary version of a life that would resolve itself into something else when he wasn't paying attention. That question he kept putting on the shelf. Then the snow came down hard in the 3rd week of December, and staying in town wasn't possible, and staying at the ranch meant staying together, which meant the walls got closer and the silences got different. It was during one of those snowbound evenings that Nora Pruitt's boy showed up at the door with a message. He was 14, red-nosed, half-frozen, clearly unhappy about being sent out in the weather. Gideon gave him a cup of hot coffee and a biscuit and read the note while the boy thawed by the fire. Nora Pruitt ran the boarding house, which meant she ran the information. The note said, in Nora's precise, fussy handwriting, that she'd heard something she thought Gideon ought to know. And would he come by when he was next in town? He looked at the note for a moment, then at Evelyn, who was across the room pretending to read. She wasn't pretending hard enough. She'd had the same page open for the last 20 minutes. He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket and told the boy he'd be in town after the snow broke. He didn't mention it to Evelyn. She didn't ask about it. But that night she was quieter than usual, and he had the distinct impression, not for the first time, that she knew more about what was being said in town than she let on. The snow broke 3 days after Christmas. Gideon rode into Blackstone Ridge on a Tuesday morning with a supply list in his pocket and Nora Pruitt's note behind it. Nora met him at the door of the boarding house herself, which she only did for people she was taking seriously, and brought him into the small back parlor she reserved for conversation she didn't want traveling through the walls. She was a practical woman in her mid-50s, iron-haired, with the kind of directness that sometimes felt like an attack and other times felt like a gift. She poured tea he didn't want and handed it to him and said, "I'll just say it plain." "That'd be fine," Gideon said. That law firm name on the letter she received. Hargrove and Associates, out of Boston. My sister's husband worked in shipping out of Boston for 11 years. He knew the name. She set down her own cup. "They handle estates, Gideon, very large ones. They're not the kind of firm that writes letters to women staying in boarding houses in St. Louis." He looked at her. "They're the kind of firm," she said carefully, "that writes letters to heirs." The word sat between them in the small room. "You don't know that," he said. "No, I don't. I'm telling you what I know and what I suspect, and I'm leaving the rest to you." She looked at him steadily. "I like you, Gideon. You've had enough hard luck. I don't want to see you made a fool of." "Made a fool of how, exactly?" Nora folded her hands in her lap. "A woman with no name and no family and no money doesn't receive correspondence from a Boston estate firm. Those things don't go together. Which means at least one of the things she's told you about herself isn't true." He drove back to the ranch with the supply wagon loaded and his mind doing the thing it did when it had a problem it couldn't set down. Working it from different angles, laying pieces next to each other, trying to find the shape of what he was actually looking at. Evelyn Whitmore Vale. The middle name that wasn't a middle name. The pauses when he asked where she'd been. Philadelphia, San Francisco, St. Louis. A trail of places that suggested someone moving, not drifting. Someone deliberately relocating, the way a person relocated when they were putting distance between themselves and something specific. He thought about her hands on his ledger that first morning. The speed of it. The precision. You didn't learn to read accounts that fast helping a man in Philadelphia manage estates. You learned to read them like that by managing them yourself, or by having them managed on your behalf long enough that you absorbed the structure of them without trying. He pulled up to the barn and sat in the wagon for a minute without getting out. Then he got out and unloaded the supplies and went inside for supper and sat across the table from her and said nothing about any of it. Because he didn't know what to do with what he suspected, and he needed to know what to do before he did it. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Blackstone Ridge had already moved well past suspicion and into the business of public opinion, which in a town that size was a more dangerous thing. It started at the feed store, the way most things started in Blackstone Ridge, which was where men gathered when they had opinions and time, and the particular combination of boredom and grievance that made small-town gossip feel like civic duty. Dale Mercer was there, which was not coincidental. Dale Mercer had not forgotten about the $34, and he was a man who packaged his personal grudges inside the language of community concern, which made him effective in a way he probably didn't fully understand. "What I'm saying," Mercer was saying to whoever was listening, "is that a woman who lies about her name is a woman who lies about other things. That's not complicated." Hank Rowell pushed back. Hank was decent, in the stubborn, slow way that decent men were decent in small towns. Not dramatically, not eloquently, but with a persistence that sometimes mattered. "You don't know she lied about anything. You know she's got a letter from a law firm." "Hargrove and Associates don't write letters to penniless orphans," Mercer said. And if she's not penniless, then what was she doing answering a matrimonial advertisement? What does a wealthy woman want with a struggling rancher? Nobody had a clean answer to that, which was the whole problem. The conversation at the feed store went in the way conversations in small towns went. It expanded. By the end of the week, the version circulating had grown past Nora's careful phrasing and Mercer's pointed insinuations into a collection of theories that ranged from Evelyn being a con woman who targeted struggling ranchers to the considerably more dramatic suggestion that she was hiding from a husband in the East. Two women stopped Gideon on the street to express concern. The particular kind of concern that looks like sympathy but functions as information delivery. He thanked them politely and gave them nothing to work with, which he knew from experience only made them more certain that there was something to work with. He hadn't said anything to Evelyn about any of this. He'd been waiting for what exactly he couldn't say. Some moment of clarity, some look on her face that told him something he didn't already know. He got it on a Friday evening in January. He'd come in late from the north pasture, cold and irritated, and she was at the stove, and there was a knock at the door that he answered still in his coat. It was Will Castor, who ran the small barber shop and was generally inoffensive, but who had the nervous quality of a man delivering news he wished he'd been able to avoid. "Gideon," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you at home. There's talk going around, and I thought you should hear it from someone who doesn't mean you ill by it." He paused. "They're saying she's not who she said, that she came to you under false pretenses. Some people are saying that you have the right to—" He stopped, shifted his hat in his hands. "Some people are saying you should send her back." Gideon looked at him. "Who's saying that?" "It's, a few people. Mercer mostly, but once he says a thing, others pick it up." "All right, Will." Gideon's voice was entirely flat. "I appreciate you coming to tell me." "I just thought—" "I said I appreciate it." He closed the door. He turned around. Evelyn was standing at the kitchen doorway. She'd heard every word. The house wasn't big enough to have not heard it. Her face was the careful, contained expression he knew by now was what she wore when she was managing something that might otherwise show. They looked at each other across the main room. "How much of it is true?" he said. Not an accusation, just the question, finally, put out in the open air between them. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "More than I've told you," she said. "Less than they think." "Evelyn?" "I know." Something shifted in her face, not breaking exactly, but the careful surface of it developed a crack. "I know I owe you more than that." "You owe me the truth," he said. "That's all." She came out of the doorway and sat down at the kitchen table, and he pulled off his coat and sat across from her, and she told him some of it. Not all of it. He would understand later that this was the first layer, that the full truth had more depth than she was ready to hand over in one evening. But some of it. Her full name was Evelyn Whitmore Vale. The Whitmore was her mother's family name. Her father, James Vale, had made a significant fortune in railroad contracting in the years before his death in 1874. Not a man anyone outside of certain financial circles would have heard of, but within those circles, substantial. When he died, the estate passed to her mother, and when her mother died 2 years later, it passed to Evelyn as the only surviving child. She'd been 24 years old and suddenly one of the wealthiest women in the Northeast, which was a thing that happened to very few women and carried with it a set of problems that most people looking at the number in the ledger would not have predicted. "What kind of problems?" Gideon said. She looked at him. "The kind where every man you meet is looking at the fortune before he finishes looking at you. Where you can't tell, when someone's kind to you, whether they're kind to you or to what you represent. Where the people managing your estate have an interest in your decisions that doesn't necessarily match your own interest." She paused. "I got engaged twice. Both men they seemed fine. They seemed like they cared about me." She stopped again, and this time the pause was longer. "They didn't. Not in any way that mattered when things got difficult." He said nothing. She continued. "I'd been managing the estate myself for 2 years. The lawyers didn't like it. I was getting better at finding what they didn't want me to find. When my second engagement ended, I decided—" She stopped, looked at her hands on the table. "I decided I needed to know if any man would choose me when there was nothing to choose me for." The fire crackled. The wind was doing its thing outside. "So you went looking for the most practical, stripped-down arrangement you could find." Gideon said slowly. Yes. A man who said plainly he didn't want anything except someone with nothing. Yes. And you answered as someone with nothing. Yes. Her eyes came up to his. I wasn't trying to deceive you about who I am as a person. Everything I've told you about myself, how I work, what I'm capable of, what I want, that's true. But the money I didn't tell you about. He sat back in his chair. It was a lot to put in order. The image he'd had of her, a woman who had been through hard times, capable and contained, making a practical choice, was still accurate, but it was sitting now inside a much larger frame than he'd realized. The letter from Boston, he said. The estate lawyers. They've been trying to reach me. There are decisions to be made about investments, about the trust structure. She said it flatly, without drama. I left without resolving several things. How much, he said. The estate? How much? She told him. He sat very still. $340,000 was a number that didn't fit easily into a room the size of theirs, in a house like theirs, on a ranch that owed money to the bank and a general store and the county tax office. It was a number from a different world entirely, from the world Nora Pruitt's sister's husband had glimpsed from the edges in Boston shipping, the world where Hargrove and Associates operated, a world that had no particular reason to overlap with West Texas scrubland and failing cattle operations, and a rancher who had spent 3 years eating alone. All right, he said finally. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Gideon, I need a minute. She was quiet. She gave him the minute. He wasn't angry, exactly. He identified the shape of what he was feeling, and it was closer to a kind of dislocation. The particular vertigo of discovering that the ground beneath you was built differently than you thought. Not gone, not collapsed, just different. She was still the same woman who'd set his books in order and fixed his fence in the cold and stayed up all night watching his cattle and made coffee before he was awake. None of that had changed. The facts had expanded, not reversed. But the story he'd been telling himself about her. And he could see now that he had been telling himself a story despite all his careful practicality. That story needed to be rebuilt from a different set of materials. They're saying you deceived me, he said. The town. I know what they're saying. Did you? She didn't look away. I withheld something. Whether that's deception depends on what I owed you at the start. And at the start, I didn't owe you my complete financial history. I answered your advertisement honestly as a person. The money was... She paused. The money was the one thing I needed to not be real, just for a while. He looked at her for a long time. She held the look, which was something she always did. She didn't drop her eyes under a direct gaze the way most people did. She stayed with it, which was both unsettling and he'd found something he'd come to rely on. Mercer's going to keep talking, he said. Yes. People in this town will decide whatever they decide. Yes. You understand that doesn't change things here. He said it before he'd consciously decided to say it, which surprised him. But it came out clear. Whatever they say out there doesn't change what happens on this ranch. Something moved across her face. Quick, barely there, gone. I understand, she said. Good. He stood up. I'm going to sleep. He went to bed. He lay awake for most of the next 2 hours. He was not a man who examined his feelings particularly. He was better at working around them. But even he could see that what he'd just said wasn't a purely practical statement. That was more than ranch management talking. He wasn't ready to look at what it was yet. But he'd said it, and he'd meant it, and those two things together were probably enough to start with. What happened the following week was something he hadn't anticipated. Mercer's campaign, and that was what it had become, Gideon could see the shape of it now, moved into a new phase. The story circulating was that Evelyn had deceived a grieving widower, that she'd used a false name and a false background to worm herself into a vulnerable man's home and finances. The irony of the real situation, that she was worth 100 times more than Gideon and had helped his finances rather than damaged them, was apparently not as interesting as the version where the stranger was the villain. The cruelest version, the one that clearly originated with Mercer or his wife, was simply the charity bride with the fake name. It was designed to do exactly what it did, which was reduce her, strip her down to the most dismissible version of herself. A desperate woman who lied to get a roof over her head. Gideon heard it used to his face for the first time at the feed store on a Wednesday in mid-January, delivered by a man named Clement who was not particularly smart, but was very willing to say things other people were only willing to think. "That charity bride of yours," Clement said, addressing Gideon with the confidence of someone certain of his audience. "You figure out yet what she's really after?" The feed store went quiet in the particular way that spaces went quiet when something was about to happen or had already started happening. Gideon set down what he was holding. He looked at Clement. "What she's really after," he said, "is none of your business. What I'll tell you for free is that she's found more money. Mercer over there has been skimming off my account in the last 6 months than your whole operation probably turned over in the fall. So whatever story's going around about my wife, you might want to think about where it started and why." The quiet got different. Mercer was in the back of the store. He didn't say anything. Gideon picked up what he'd been holding and went to the counter and completed his transaction and left. His hands weren't entirely steady on the wagon reins on the way home. He'd surprised himself. He was not given to that kind of public declaration. He was a man who kept his business private and his opinions guarded, and his personal life as far from the town's appetite for information as geography allowed. He'd stood up for her. In front of a room full of people, against a man who had more social leverage in Blackstone Ridge than Gideon had, he'd stood up for her before he'd even consciously decided to do it. That fact disturbed him considerably more than he expected it to. He told himself it was basic fairness. He told himself it was what any man ought to do when someone in his household was being talked about unfairly in public. He told himself these things with the committed energy of a man arguing against himself, which meant, as it always did, that the argument was probably already lost. He pulled up to the ranch and unhitched the horse and went inside, and she was at the stove. And he sat down at the kitchen table and she put a plate in front of him without asking and sat across from him, and they ate without talking the way they usually did. Halfway through supper, she said, "You said something at the feed store." He looked up. "Will Castor has a faster mouth than I remembered." "What did you say?" He told her, abbreviated. She looked at her plate. Then she looked at him. Her expression was, he couldn't read it entirely. There was something in it that was new, or that was something he'd seen in glimpses before and not been able to name. Something that was the opposite of the careful containment she usually wore. Something that looked, briefly, like a woman who hadn't expected kindness and was still figuring out what to do when it arrived. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. Mercer won't forget it." He wasn't going to forget the $34 anyway. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "Why did you?" He picked up his fork again. Outside, the January wind was doing its grinding, relentless thing against the north side of the house. "Because it needed doing," he said. "Eat your supper." She ate her supper. He ate his. The fire held. The wind didn't come through the walls. But something had changed in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. And the evening went on the way evenings did. The lamp, the books, the quiet, except that the quiet had a different texture now, heavier and warmer at once, the way January air felt when you finally came in from the cold. The letter from Boston was still somewhere in her room, still unopened or opened and put away. He didn't know which. The name Whitmore was still in the back of his mind where he'd put it. The town was still talking, would probably keep talking for the better part of the winter. But Gideon Vance had stood up in the feed store and called her his wife, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the advertisement he'd placed and everything to do with the woman who'd shown up in answer to it. He wasn't ready to say that out loud. He wasn't sure he'd ever be that kind of man. But the feeling was there, solid and inconvenient, and apparently not asking for his permission. The feeling Gideon couldn't name kept living in the house with them through the rest of January. He was careful with it the way you were careful with something that might shatter if you looked at it directly. Keeping it in his peripheral vision, going about the business of the ranch, the cattle, the accounts, the daily machinery of surviving a West Texas winter. He was good at keeping himself busy. He had been keeping himself busy for 3 years in the particular way that grief required, the way that loss made a man find tasks where stillness used to be, because stillness had a different quality after someone was gone from your life. Now the stillness had a different quality again, and for a completely opposite reason, and he didn't know what to do with that either. Evelyn, for her part, was the same as she had always been, which was to say she was present, incapable, and consistently difficult to read. If the conversation in the kitchen after the feed store incident had changed something for her, she didn't show it in any way he could point to. She still got up before him. The coffee was still there. The books were still in better order than he'd left them. She still turned papers face down when he came into the room at the wrong moment. Still gave those small, precise pauses before answering certain questions. Still watched the land from the kitchen window with the expression of someone calculating something she hadn't shared yet. What was different, what he noticed and filed away and tried not to make too much of, was a series of very small things. The way she'd sometimes look up from her book in the evenings and hold his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary before looking back down. The way she'd started occasionally saying his name at the beginning of a sentence rather than just starting the sentence, like she was making sure she had the right person's attention. The way she'd laughed once, briefly, at something he'd said, a dry thing about the county assessor's response letter, and the laugh had startled them both equally, like a bird flying out of a bush. February came in cold and stayed cold, and the ranch held together by the particular combination of Evelyn's management and Gideon's stubbornness, neither of which was sufficient alone. The letter from Boston was still somewhere in her room. He knew it was still there because the situation it represented, the unresolved estate, the lawyers waiting, hadn't resolved itself. He could feel it the way you felt an unfinished thing at the edge of a room, like a task not crossed off a list. He didn't push her on it. She'd tell him when she was ready, or she wouldn't, and either way the ranch needed feeding. What he didn't know, and what would matter considerably later, was that she had finally opened it. She'd opened it on a night in late January when the wind was bad enough that she couldn't sleep, sitting at the small desk in her room by lamplight, and she'd read it 3 times before she folded it back up and sat for a long while looking at nothing in particular. The contents were what she'd expected. A formal request from the estate firm to return to Boston for a period of time sufficient to make several significant decisions about the trust structure, the existing investments, 2 properties that required immediate action. Written in the careful, pressured language that lawyers used when they had been waiting longer than they'd planned and wanted you to understand the patience was ending. Signed by the senior partner, a man named Hargrove she had met exactly twice and disliked both times, not for any specific reason she could articulate, but in the way you occasionally dislike someone whose fundamental understanding of the world was arranged in a way that was directly opposed to your own. What she hadn't expected was the second page. The second page was a note, not a legal document, written in a different hand. It was from a woman named Margaret Hollis, who had been her mother's closest friend and one of the few people in the world who knew the full situation, knew where Evelyn had gone, knew why, and knew enough to be worried about what she was getting into. The note said, among other things, "I've heard things, Eve, from people who know Hargrove's office. There are men interested in the estate who are using your absence as an opening. Come back before there's nothing left to come back to." Evelyn had folded both pages back into the envelope and put it in the bottom of her bag under everything else, and lain down on her bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had not slept well since. This was the situation in the house. Gideon carrying a feeling he couldn't name, Evelyn carrying a letter she hadn't shown him, when February brought the windstorm that broke everything open. It started in the late afternoon, which was unusual. Most of the big prairie winds came overnight or in the early morning, when the temperature differential between the ground and the upper air was at its most violent. This one built through the afternoon in a way that felt almost deliberate, the sky going the particular flat, dirty yellow that meant serious weather, the cattle getting restless in the way they got when something in the air told them to move, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in less than an hour. Gideon spent the afternoon securing what needed securing. He'd been through enough of these to know the specific checklist, the barn doors, the north fence gate, the loose boards on the south side of the house that he'd been meaning to properly nail down since October, and hadn't. He moved through it quickly and came inside as the first real wall of wind hit, rattling the windows in their frames like something trying to get in. Evelyn had supper on the table, which he ate fast and without much conversation because there was a tension in the house that was partly the storm and partly something else. He'd seen it on her face when he came in, that look of a person managing something internal, and he'd let it sit because he didn't know what else to do with it. After supper, he sat at the desk in the main room working through a set of figures the bank had sent regarding the loan terms. The wind picked up another degree. The lamp flickered twice. In her room, he could hear her moving around, the sounds of a person who wasn't settling in for the night the way she normally would. Then the wind hit the house in a way that was different from the other gusts. Not just a push, but a sustained force that went on for several seconds, long enough to feel like something structural was being tested. The window in her room, the one that faced north and had a slightly warped frame that he'd also been meaning to fix, blew open with a sound like a rifle shot. He heard her exclamation. Short, sharp, not the kind of sound she usually made. He was up and in the hallway before he'd consciously decided to move, and through her door, which was open now from the force of the same gust, and the scene was papers everywhere. The wind had come through the window and taken everything off the small desk in the corner and scattered it across the room in a single second. Her writing materials, her book, the contents of the bag she kept on the desk. And the letter. The envelope from Boston had landed at his feet, and the 2 pages had separated from it, and one of them, the note, Margaret Hollis's handwriting, the second page, had been caught by a secondary gust and skated across the floorboards and stopped against the leg of the bed 3 feet from where he stood. He got the window shut. He latched it properly with the piece of wire he'd rigged for it months ago. He turned around. Evelyn was standing in the middle of the room looking at the papers on the floor. Her face was doing something he hadn't seen before. The controlled surface completely gone, not from any single strong emotion, but from the sheer quantity of them happening at once. A person caught without her armor on. He looked down at the page by the bed. He could see the handwriting clearly from where he stood. He could read the first several lines without meaning to. Margaret Hollis's note. I've heard things, Eve, from people who know Hargrove's office. There are men interested in the estate who are using your absence. He stopped reading. He looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she crossed the room and picked up the page and the envelope and began gathering the other scattered papers from the floor, and her movements had the quality of a person doing something with their hands because their hands needed something to do. He should have left. He knew that. It was her room and her papers, and he'd come in without being asked, and the decent thing was to close the door behind him and give her privacy. He didn't leave. Evelyn, he said. I'll fix the window properly tomorrow, she said, not looking at him. There's a piece of lumber in the barn that would brace the frame. Evelyn, the latch has been bad since before I got here. You mentioned it in... Stop. His voice was quiet. Not hard, not angry, just finished with the detour. Stop. She stopped. She was still holding the gathered papers, the envelope on top of them. She wasn't looking at him. I didn't read it, he said. I could see part of it. I didn't read it. A pause. I know, she said. You wouldn't. Tell me. He said it simply. Whatever's in there, tell me. She set the papers on the desk. She stood with her back to him for a moment, long enough that he thought maybe she wasn't going to. Then she turned around, and she told him all of it. The real version, not the first layer version she'd given him in January. The full account. Her father's death, the estate, the 2 men she'd been engaged to, and what had actually happened with both of them. Not the abbreviated version, but the details. The specific ways in which both situations had made clear that the money was the thing being pursued, and she was the mechanism for accessing it. The lawyers who had been managing things in her absence, who may or may not have been managing them in her interest. The letter from Margaret Hollis, which she read to him directly, all of it, including the part about men using her absence as an opening. She told him about the decision she'd made in St. Louis in the autumn. Not a desperate decision, she was clear about that, but a deliberate one. She'd had enough money to survive indefinitely in boarding houses or hotels or anywhere else she wanted to go. She had not answered his advertisement out of poverty or desperation. She had answered it because it was the most honest thing she'd seen in a long time. A man who wanted exactly what he'd said he wanted, nothing more. And she had wanted to find out, one more time, whether what she suspected about herself and men and money was the truth or just something she'd been telling herself. She wanted to know if any man would choose her when there was nothing to choose. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The windstorm was still working at the house, but it had dropped to a lower register. a steady pressure rather than the violent gusting of an hour before. The lamp in the corner threw a low, unsteady light. Gideon had not sat down. He was standing near the door where he'd been since the beginning, and he was doing the thing he did when he was working something through. Still, arms crossed, not looking at her directly but not looking away either. She watched him. Whatever was on her face now, she wasn't trying to manage it. There was no controlled surface left to manage. She looked tired in the way people looked when they'd been holding something for a very long time and had finally set it down somewhere. Not relief exactly, but the specific exhaustion that followed. "You felt humiliated," she said. She said it before he could say anything, which surprised them both. "When I told you the amount in January, I saw it. I wasn't humiliated." He said it, then stopped, then said, "I didn't know what to do with it." "I know. That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." A silence. Outside, something loose on the barn roof knocked twice against the wood. "You've been waiting for me to be angry about the money," he said. "I've been waiting to find out who you'd turn into when you knew everything." She said it without accusation, just a statement of fact. Everyone turns into someone else when they know. Everyone meaning the two men in the East, and others before them, and the lawyers, and people I thought were friends. She looked at him steadily. "Money is a lens. It changes what people see when they look at you. I don't blame them for it particularly. It's just what happens." Gideon uncrossed his arms. He took a few steps further into the room and sat down on the edge of the desk chair, not settling in, just enough to change the geometry of the conversation. "I don't know what to do with the amount," he said. "I'll tell you that straight. I'm a man who's been fighting to keep this ranch alive for 3 years, and the number you're talking about is so far outside anything I've ever dealt with that I can't make sense of it in relation to what's happening here." He paused. "But that's my problem to sort out, not yours." She blinked, something she hadn't expected. "The question I actually care about," he continued, "is what you want. Not what the lawyers want. Not what Hargrove wants or those men Margaret's talking about. What you want." She was quiet. It was a different quality of quiet from her usual silences. Not contained, not managed, but genuinely open. "I don't know," she said. And then, more quietly, "That's the first honest answer I've given anyone in a very long time." He looked at her, and in the low, unstable light of that storm-hammered room, with papers still scattered on the floor and the window frame cracked where the wind had forced it, he said the thing he'd been working toward without knowing it since October. "I saw you before I saw the money," he said. "First day at the station. I didn't know anything about Whitmore or Boston or estates. I just saw a woman who looked at a dying train platform like she was figuring out how to fix it." He stopped, looked at his own hands for a moment. "Everything after that, the ledgers, the fence, the cattle, I saw all of it before I knew any of the rest. The money doesn't change what I saw." Evelyn Vale. Whitmore Vale. The woman who had outlasted 2 engagements and a room full of lawyers and a decade of being looked at through the wrong kind of glass, stood in her cold bedroom in West Texas and heard those words, and something in her face did something he'd never seen it do. She didn't cry. She wasn't that kind of woman, and the situation wasn't built for it, and the tears, if they were there somewhere, stayed where they were. But the thing that was always slightly held in reserve in her expression, that last percentage of withheld presence, the part she never gave anyone, gave way, just briefly. Just enough. "I believe you," she said. Her voice was rough at the edges in a way it never was. "I didn't expect to." Neither of them said anything else for a little while. The storm worked in the house. The lamp held. At some point, Gideon got up and went back to the main room, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire for another hour and didn't talk much. But the silence was different from any silence the house had held before. Not empty, not careful, just 2 people in the same room, not needing to fill it. He went to bed eventually. She stayed up by the fire. What neither of them talked about that night, what they would only begin to work through in the days that followed, was the letter from Margaret Hollis and the question it raised. Because whatever Gideon had said about the money not changing what he saw, the money still existed, and it was still in Boston, and there were still people moving around it in her absence with their own interests and their own designs. The estate wasn't going to wait indefinitely for her to finish figuring out what she wanted from a ranch in West Texas. The problem with running away from something, even when the running was deliberate and purposeful and answered a question that needed answering. The problem was that what you ran from didn't stay where you left it. The following morning, Gideon came down to find her already at the kitchen table, but not with the ledger. She had a blank piece of paper in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she'd written one line at the top and stopped. She heard him come in and didn't turn the paper over. That was new. He looked at it from across the room. The line at the top said, "Dear Margaret." He put the coffee on and didn't say anything about it, and she wrote the letter while the coffee heated, and whatever she wrote to Margaret Hollis was her business, and she'd tell him what he needed to know when she was ready. But she hadn't turned the paper over. That was the thing. After all the face-down pages and careful pauses and managed silences, she had written a letter with him in the room and left it facing up. And he thought about that at various points throughout the day while he worked and couldn't entirely account for why it felt significant. It felt like trust. Not declared, not announced, just present. The same way she'd been present from the first day. Quietly, stubbornly, with bleeding hands and good coffee and numbers that told the truth about people who didn't want you to look too closely. He was thinking about this, coming in from the barn at dusk 3 days later, when Hank Rowell rode up to the fence line and called his name. Hank was not a man who made social calls as a rule, particularly not at dusk in February on a week when the weather had been unreliable. He sat his horse at the fence with the expression of a man carrying news he'd rather not be carrying. "Just came from town," Hank said. "Thought you should know. Mercer's been talking to the bank." Gideon went still. "What do you mean, talking to the bank?" "I mean, he went in there with some kind of claim about your credit situation and your wife's identity and—" "I don't know exactly, Gideon. I wasn't there. I'm telling you what Pete Lyle told me." He shifted in his saddle. "But Pete said it had something to do with the loan, whether the terms were made under— I don't know how to say this exactly— whether the terms were made with accurate information about your household situation." Gideon looked at him. "They're trying to call the loan," Gideon said. Not a question. Hank's face confirmed it. He stood at the fence after Hank rode away and looked at the last gray light over the plains to the west and felt the cold working through his coat and thought about how much could go wrong in a man's life and how most of it, in his experience, went wrong all at once rather than in the orderly sequence that would have made it manageable. He turned and went inside. Evelyn looked up from the table when he came in. She read his face the way she read his ledgers, quickly, thoroughly, finding the problem before he had to name it. "What happened?" she said. He told her about Mercer and the bank. She sat very still while he talked. When he finished, she set down her pen. "How much is the loan?" she said. "Evelyn." "Gideon, how much?" He told her the amount. The full number. The banknote. The accumulated interest. What it would take to settle it cleanly. She looked at the table surface for a moment. Then she looked at him. And what he saw on her face then was not the careful, contained expression he'd learned in the months since October. It was something else, something that had come to a decision. He recognized the look. He'd seen it on her face at the train station, the first day. That moment when she'd stepped off onto the platform and looked at the dusty town around her and calculated something and decided. She'd decided something now too. He could see it clearly. He just didn't yet know what it was. That look on her face stayed with him through the night. They didn't talk further about the bank that evening. Evelyn had gone quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was working something through. Not the closed-off quiet of a person shutting down, but the concentrated silence of someone running calculations in their head, sorting variables, arriving at conclusions in the private space behind her eyes. He recognized it by now. He'd seen it over ledgers and fence posts and sick cattle. It meant she was building something in her mind that she'd show him when it was ready. He didn't push her. He had gotten somewhat better, over the months since October, at understanding which silences wanted filling and which ones needed leaving alone. But he slept badly. The news Hank had brought sat in his chest with a specific weight. The weight of something you'd been half expecting but had managed to keep in the category of possible rather than actual until it crossed the line. Mercer going to the bank was not surprising in retrospect. It was the logical escalation of a campaign that had started with gossip at the feed store and moved through social pressure into something with actual legal teeth. If the bank could be persuaded that the loan terms had been made under false pretenses, that Gideon had misrepresented his household situation, or that Evelyn's identity complications created some kind of liability, Then calling the note early became a business decision rather than a personal attack. It was elegant, in the way that mean things were sometimes elegant. Mercer had found the one lever that could actually move something. In the morning, Evelyn was at the table before him as always, but there was no ledger open and no letter in progress. She was sitting with both hands around her coffee cup, looking at nothing in particular, and when he came in, she looked up at him with the expression of someone who had arrived at a decision overnight and was now dealing with the particular discomfort of what the decision required. "I need to go into town today," she said. He sat down across from her. "All right." "Alone." He looked at her. "There are things I need to do that will be easier without you there," she said. Not unkindly, just direct. "I need you to trust me on that." The word trust sat between them with some weight behind it, given everything that had been said and unsaid in the past weeks. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to handle the bank situation." "Evelyn?" "Gideon." She set down the cup. "I have the means to handle it. You know that. The question is whether you're going to make this difficult for me by arguing about it, or whether you're going to let me do what I can do." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't like it. He could feel the particular resistance of a man who had been managing his own problems alone for a long time and had strong opinions about continuing to do so. Using her money to solve his debt was a thing his pride had significant objections to, and those objections were not entirely irrational, and he knew she knew that. "The ranch debt is my debt," he said. "It's got my name on it." "It does." "Using your money to pay it is something I get to decide to do or not do," she said. "It's my money. The decision is mine." She paused. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and asking you not to make it harder than it needs to be." He looked at her for a long time. There was something almost painful about this moment, about sitting across from a woman and having the argument reversed on him so cleanly. He was supposed to be the one solving problems. He had built his entire self-understanding, particularly over the last 3 years, around being the man who carried his own weight without assistance. Asking for help was not something he did. Receiving it was not something he was good at. But he thought about what she'd said in that storm-battered room. "I wanted to know if any man would choose me when there was nothing to choose me for." And he thought about the specific cruelty it would be to, at this moment, reduce what was between them to a transaction he couldn't stomach. She wasn't offering him money. She was offering him herself. The full version, the one that came with a railroad fortune and Boston lawyers, and all the complications he'd specifically said in his advertisement he didn't want. She was putting all of it on the table, here, now, for a ranch that she had no legal obligation to save, and a man who had started this whole arrangement by saying he didn't want love or complications. He thought about Clara, in the way he thought about Clara sometimes, not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of retrospective gratitude for what she'd taught him about what a person could be to another person when they meant it. He thought Clara would have liked Evelyn considerably. He thought Clara would have told him to stop being an idiot. "All right," he said. Evelyn picked up her coffee cup. "Thank you," she said. She rode into Blackstone Ridge that morning on the better of his 2 horses, which he'd saddled for her without being asked, and he watched her go down the road toward town until the distance made her small and then gone. And then he went out to the north pasture and found work to do with his hands, because standing still wasn't something he was capable of on a day like this. He had no idea what she was going to do, specifically, and that bothered him in a way he couldn't resolve by working. He mucked out 2 stalls that didn't strictly need it, and repaired a section of fence that was more cosmetic than structural, and reorganized the feed storage in the barn in a way that made better sense but hadn't needed doing today. And all of it moved through the front of his mind while something else happened in the back of it. A persistent low-grade alertness that he recognized eventually as the feeling of caring about what happened to someone. He hadn't felt that in 3 years. It was, he discovered, not particularly comfortable. She was gone for most of the day. She came back in the late afternoon when the light was going flat and cold over the plains. He heard the horse coming up the road and went to the front of the barn and watched her come in. She looked tired, the particular tiredness of someone who had been in sustained conflict for several hours and had managed it through sheer will rather than comfort. Her posture was still straight, because her posture was always straight, but something in it was held more deliberately than usual. She dismounted and handed him the reins and looked at him. "It's done," she said. He waited. "The bank debt is settled. Full amount, plus the interest accumulated since last year. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. The deed will be clear in your name within the week, once the paperwork clears. He stood with the horse's reins in his hand and looked at her. Mercer was there, she continued, at the bank. He came in while I was there, which I don't think was accidental. I think someone told him I was coming. He made several claims about my identity and the legitimacy of your household situation to the bank manager, a Mr. Aldous, who I think is an essentially fair man who had been put in an unfair position by someone with a loud opinion. What happened? I provided Mr. Aldous with documentation of my identity, my estate, and my legal status as your wife. I also provided him with documentation of the overcharging Mercer has been doing on your account since February of last year, which I had already had notarized by the county clerk 2 weeks ago. A pause. Just in case it became useful. Gideon blinked. You had it notarized. I suspected this moment was coming. Mercer is not a complicated man. She said it without particular satisfaction. He told Aldous I was a fraud. I showed Aldous who I was and what Mercer had been doing and invited Mr. Aldous to decide which party had a cleaner record of honesty in that bank. He stared at her. Mercer left before the meeting was finished, she said. A long, slow silence. Evelyn, he said, it needed doing. She took a breath. The horse needs water. She worked hard today. She walked past him toward the house, and he stood there holding the reins for a moment with the particular sensation of having just watched something he didn't entirely have a category for. Not rescue, not exactly, or not in the diminishing way that word sometimes carried. Something more like watching a person be completely and utterly themselves in a high-stakes situation and discovering that who they were was considerably more formidable than the circumstances trying to reduce them. He watered the horse. He took his time with it. Then he went inside. She was making supper. He could smell it from the doorway. Something with the dried beef from the cold storage and onion and what was probably the last of the pepper, the same combination she'd made his first night with a faint variation that had gotten better over months of iteration. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her at the stove. Why? He said. She didn't turn around. I already told you why. The bank, not the specifics. He came into the kitchen and stopped a few feet behind her. Why this ranch? Why this specific problem? You didn't have to come to West Texas to answer your question. You could have gone anywhere. You could have... He stopped. You're worth enough to live anywhere in the world, and you came here. She was quiet, still working at the stove. I know, she said. That's not an answer. She set down the spoon. She turned around. She was about 4 feet from him in a kitchen that didn't have a lot of extra space to begin with, and she looked at him with that direct, present quality she'd always had, fully there, fully paying attention. You built me a home, she said, before you knew I was worth anything. He didn't say anything. Not because you were trying to, she continued, not because you were performing the role of a good man. You cleared that room out and bought a mattress on credit you couldn't afford, and drove a wagon in the cold to pick me up from a train station because you thought I had nothing, and you decided that was enough reason to treat me decently. She paused. Do you understand how rare that is? He held her gaze. He was aware that the kitchen was warm and the light was low, and they were standing closer together than they'd stood before. And he was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was inconvenient and clarifying at once. You paid off my debt, he said. His voice was rougher than he intended. Yes, that's not a small thing to take on. That's not Gideon. She said his name the way she'd been saying it for months, like it was hers to say, like she'd decided that early and hadn't bothered to announce the decision. I know what it is. I did it because I wanted to, because this place matters to me, and you matter to me, and I am finished running from things that matter. The last sentence landed with a weight that changed the room. He reached up and put his hand against her face. Not dramatically, not with any flourish. Just his hand against her cheek, rough from the cold and the work, and she didn't move back from it. She looked at him, and the last careful reserve he'd seen in her expression since October was simply gone. Spent. Given up for something better. I'm going to need you to stay, he said. It came out almost nothing, a voice not built for this kind of admission. I need you to understand that's what I'm asking, not just through the winter, Not just while the situation with the estate is, I know what you're asking, she said. And? She put her hand over his, the one against her face. Her hands were still marked with old fence wire cuts, the small scars that had never entirely faded. And yes, she said. He kissed her. It was not a perfect moment. The stove was still going behind her, and the supper was probably going to burn, and somewhere outside an animal was making the sound of wanting to be fed. It was a kitchen in a farmhouse in West Texas in February, cold everywhere, except where they were standing, and neither of them were the kind of people who came easily to this, and it showed in the slightly uncertain way it happened, like two people arriving at the same door from different directions. But it was real, and in the absence of perfect real was considerably better. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen before. The supper, she said, is probably burning. Yes. She turned back to the stove, and he stepped back and they salvaged the supper, which was mostly fine but slightly scorched along the bottom of the pan, and they ate it at the kitchen table the same as always, except that nothing was the same as always, and they both knew it, and neither of them made a production of it, which was exactly right. The days that followed were different in every way that wasn't visible from the outside, and several ways that were. Hank Rowell noticed it first, coming to the ranch for a practical reason 3 days after the bank settlement, and leaving with the expression of a man who had observed something he was going to spend a long time being happy about. Will Castor noticed it when they came into town together the following week, and it was visible in something about the way they stood near each other on the street, some quality of proximity that hadn't been there before. Nora Pruitt, who noticed everything, said nothing to either of them, but was seen at the post office writing a letter, and given that Nora Pruitt only wrote letters when she had news worth sending, whatever she wrote to whoever she sent it to was probably accurate. Mercer avoided Gideon entirely after the bank, which suited Gideon. The man had played his hand and lost it, and Blackstone Ridge understood that kind of defeat in the pragmatic way that small frontier towns understood defeat. Not with fanfare, just with a quiet repositioning of social leverage in a direction away from the loser. But the thing that occupied Gideon most in the days after the supper that burned was something she hadn't mentioned and he'd been waiting for her to bring up. The estate, Boston, the lawyers waiting on decisions she'd been deferring since October, Margaret Hollis's warning about men using her absence. He brought it up himself on a Saturday, sitting at the table after breakfast. You need to deal with Boston, he said. She looked up. She'd been writing again, Brota. She was always writing now. Letters to Margaret mostly, sometimes what appeared to be formal correspondence that she sealed carefully and addressed in a precise hand. I know. Margaret's letter, the men Hargrove's been allowing near the estate. I've been corresponding with Margaret. She's managing what she can on that end. She set down the pen. I'll need to go back. He went still. Not permanently, she said, reading him the way she always did, immediately and accurately. But I need to be present for certain decisions. There are 2 properties that need immediate instruction. The trust structure needs to be renegotiated in a way Hargrove won't do without my physical presence, because he thinks my absence means he has latitude. Her voice had an edge on it when she said Hargrove's name that told him several things about that relationship. 3 to 4 weeks, possibly 5. That's a long time to leave a ranch in winter. You managed for 3 years alone. That was before. She looked at him across the table. Something in her face softened at the edges. I know, she said. I'll come back. I know you will. He said it without hesitation, which surprised him a little. He hadn't known he was sure until he heard himself say it. I just wanted to say it's a long time. It is. She picked up the pen again. I want you to come with me. He blinked. To Boston. Eventually, yes. Not this first trip. The ranch needs you here, and there's no one else. But when I go back to close things out properly, finalize everything, deal with the properties, she looked at him steadily. I want you there. He thought about Gideon Vance in Boston. He thought about the man he was, the calloused hands and the sun-damaged face, and the working knowledge of cattle breeding and West Texas soil composition. Standing in an office with a man named Hargrove, who managed estates worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He thought, I have absolutely no idea how to be in that room. He thought, she'd be in the room. All right, he said. She went to Boston in early March. On the weekly train east, with a bag considerably larger than the one she'd arrived with in October. He drove her to the station the same way he'd picked her up there, early, without ceremony, standing on the platform while the train built steam. She was wearing a different coat than she'd worn in October, one he hadn't seen before. Dark gray wool, better quality. The kind of coat that belonged to the woman she actually was, rather than the woman she'd been performing. She'd written to Margaret about the change in her situation. Margaret had apparently sent several items ahead to the boarding house where Evelyn would stay during the Boston visit. The coat fit her differently than the worn traveling clothes she'd arrived in. She looked in it like who she was. She also looked in it like someone from a world that didn't naturally intersect with his. He thought that. He noticed that he thought it and didn't try to push it away. She turned to him on the platform. 4 weeks, she said. 4 weeks? The North Well. Hank Rowell knows a man who can look at it. I left his name on the kitchen table. I'll find it. The tax adjustment should come through from the county in the next 10 days. Make sure you Evelyn. She stopped. I know how to manage the ranch, he said. She took a breath. Then she almost smiled. Not quite, but the edge of it. The thing that happened at the corner of her mouth when something struck her as accurate rather than funny. I know you do, she said. The train made its getting ready sounds. People moved around them on the platform. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them were people who made a performance of personal moments on public platforms. He said, "Come back." She said, "I will." She got on the train. He stood on the platform and watched it pull out and made himself stay until it was gone, which was the hardest part, and then turned and walked to the wagon and drove back to the ranch in the cold morning light. The house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet since before October. Different quality. Before October, the quiet had been what it was, the absence of sound in a place that expected nothing else. Now it was the absence of something specific, and that was harder to be in. He found the name she'd left on the kitchen table, exactly where she said. Beside it, she'd left a note in her handwriting. Hank already knows you'll call. He's expecting it. She'd written it before she told him, because she'd known he'd need it and known he might not ask. He put the note in his shirt pocket. He made coffee because it needed making, sat at the table for a minute because he'd been standing since before dawn, and looked at the kitchen that was more organized and better stocked and generally more functional than it had been since well before Clara died, and thought about the specific shape a person left on a place when they'd been in it and meant it. 4 weeks. He'd been alone for 3 years. He could manage 4 weeks. He was, it turned out, considerably less good at it than he expected, not in the practical sense. The ranch ran the way it always ran. The cattle were fed, the records were kept. The North Well got looked at by Hank's man, who said it needed work but was salvageable. He managed all of that fine. What he couldn't quite manage was the evenings, the lamp and the empty chair across the table, the silence that now had the wrong texture, too much space where something had been. He wrote her a letter on the 5th day. He sat at the table for a long time before he started it, and then when he started it, he didn't know how to say what he wanted to say, which was not a problem he'd anticipated having because he'd thought he wasn't particularly sentimental, and he'd been wrong about that. He wrote, "The well situation is being handled. The tax adjustment came through. You were right about the amount. The cattle are fine." Then he sat there looking at the practical facts he'd written, which were all true and none of which were the point. And he wrote one more line. "The house is too quiet. Come back when you can." He sealed it and sent it the next morning. Her reply came 11 days later, which was fast for the distance. It said, 3 weeks. And then it said, "I've told Hargrove about you. He disapproves. I thought you'd want to know that." And at the bottom, in slightly different ink, like she'd come back to add it after the rest was written, "The house will be loud again soon enough. Hold the quiet for me." He read it twice, folded it, and put it in the same pocket as the note she'd left on the table. 3 weeks. He could hold it 3 weeks. She came back on a Wednesday. He didn't know exactly which Wednesday until Hank Rowell's boy rode over the morning of and said he'd heard from the station master that the eastbound return was carrying a passenger for the Vance Ranch. Gideon didn't ask how Hank's boy knew that, or how the station master knew who the passenger was. Small towns had their own information systems, and arguing with them was pointless. He drove the wagon in. He arrived early, the same as October, and stood on the same platform with his hat on his head this time because he'd learned from the first time. The March air was cold and smelled like the particular combination of mud and dry grass that meant winter was losing its grip but hadn't admitted it yet. The train was 12 minutes late. He stood on the platform and watched it come in and thought about the man who had stood in this exact spot in October expecting a woman with nothing, and understood that he was a different man now in all the ways that accumulated slowly and couldn't be pointed to directly. He wasn't softer. He was still exactly who he'd always been in the ways that the land required, the practical, unromantic machinery of keeping a working ranch alive. But he'd been opened somewhere, not broken open, not forced, just a door he'd kept locked for 3 years had been tried from the other side and found unlocked after all. She came off the train and he knew it was her before she turned around, same as October, the same still moment of assessment on the platform step. She turned and found him immediately this time. No scanning the crowd, just directly to his face, like she knew where he'd be. She looked different and the same. The gray coat again, and she'd cut her hair slightly, a practical adjustment that changed the line of her face in a small way he noticed and couldn't have explained. She carried a larger bag than she'd arrived with in October, and a second smaller one beside it, and she didn't look for help with either of them. But when she reached him on the platform, she stopped closer than she would have in October, and the quality of her looking at him was different in the way everything was different now. Direct, warm in the specific way she was warm, which was never demonstrative but always real. "You look tired," she said. "The North Well gave us trouble last week. Hank's man didn't fix it properly. He fixed it well enough. Then we got 4 days of freeze and it needed looking at again." She nodded, filing it away. Then she looked at him for a moment without the practical framework around it. "I'm glad to be back," she said. It was the most direct personal statement she'd made to him outside of the storm-battered room in February, and it landed the way direct true things landed, without drama, just with weight. "Good," he said, and picked up her larger bag, and they walked to the wagon. She talked on the way back, which was different from October when they'd ridden in silence that could have been comfortable or could have been two strangers with nothing yet to say. Now she talked about Boston in the way she talked about everything, organized, specific, the relevant facts delivered clearly. Hargrove had been managed. The trust structure had been renegotiated in terms that gave her considerably more direct control and considerably less latitude to the partners who had been operating as if her absence were permanent. The two properties had been dealt with, one sold, one retained with a different management arrangement. Margaret Hollis had helped navigate several situations that required a local presence and a sharp eye, and Evelyn described Margaret with a warmth she didn't use for many people, a woman who had clearly been one of the few real ones in a life that had contained a lot of performed ones. "And Hargrove," Gideon said. A pause. "He'll manage." "You said he disapproves of me." "He disapproves of the situation. He would have disapproved of any situation that removed me from his sphere of management. You happen to be the specific form the situation took." She looked at the road ahead. "He'll have no further grounds to disapprove of anything. The restructuring I've done removes his ability to act without my direct instruction." "He knew you'd do that when you came back." "Yes. He was hoping I wouldn't." She said it without satisfaction, just accuracy. "He underestimated how much I'd learned in the last 5 months. About managing things. About knowing when someone's trying to work around you." She paused. "About what I actually want." The ranch came into view around the low rise. The house, the barn, the fence lines. The February windstorm had done some cosmetic damage to the south side of the barn that he hadn't fully repaired yet. A visible imperfection in the picture, boards that needed replacing and hadn't been replaced. He was aware of all the things that were still broken or insufficient or in need of work, the way a man was always aware of the gap between what a thing was and what it could be. She looked at it the same way she'd looked at it in October. The assessing expression, the inventory. "The barn south wall," she said. "I know. I can help with that this week. You've been traveling for 2 days. I've been sitting on a train for 2 days, which is different from traveling." She looked at him. "I'd rather work than sit." He knew that about her. He'd known it since the fence post before sunrise in October. "Tomorrow," he said. "Today you rest." She looked like she was going to argue and then, surprisingly, didn't. "All right," she said. Tomorrow. They got back to the ranch and he unhitched the horse and she went inside. And when he came in from the barn, she had coffee on and her bags were in her room, and she was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the land in the late afternoon light. "It's different," she said when he came in. "The light. March is different from October." "Harsher," he said. "Less forgiving." "No." She shook her head slowly. "More honest. It shows you what things actually look like without the softness." She turned from the window. "I like it better." He put his coat on the hook. He thought about the woman who had stood at this window in October and how he'd told himself then that he didn't know what to make of her presence in his kitchen. He knew now. It had taken 5 months of hard weather and harder honesty and a windstorm that scattered papers across a bedroom floor, but he knew. She poured 2 cups of coffee and put his in front of him and sat across the table. And they were, without ceremony or announcement, back in the life they'd built together. They married in late April. It was not a large wedding. Gideon had no family living, and Evelyn's only people were Margaret Hollis, who came from Boston at considerable personal inconvenience and looked at Gideon with the expression of a woman running a thorough assessment and reserving final judgment, and a second cousin of her mother's who lived in St. Louis, and who Evelyn had told him about with a complicated expression that suggested the relationship was functional rather than warm. Nora Pruitt came. Hank Rowell came with his 2 boys. Will Castor came and looked genuinely happy in the uncomplicated way of a man who had brought bad news once and was relieved to see it end well. There were a handful of others, the ranch community, the practical people, the ones whose opinion of Evelyn had been formed by watching her work rather than by listening to Mercer talk. Mercer did not come. Nobody had invited him. The ceremony was at the county courthouse rather than the church, which caused some comment among the people who tracked that kind of thing, but neither Gideon nor Evelyn were people who operated within institutions for the sake of appearance, and the judge who performed it was a decent man named Archibald Sims, who had known Gideon since the early days and shook both their hands afterward with the warmth of someone who meant it. Margaret Hollis cornered Gideon briefly at the small gathering afterward, while Evelyn was talking to Hank's older boy about something involving cattle, which was, Gideon thought, probably the most purely Evelyn social interaction possible at one's own wedding. Margaret was a sharp-faced woman in her early 50s who wore her intelligence openly in a way that suggested she'd stopped apologizing for it some time ago. She looked at Gideon for a moment with the frank assessment that reminded him, actually, of Evelyn in a completely different register. "She wrote to me about you in November," Margaret said. "Is that so?" "She said you were the most stubbornly self-sufficient man she'd ever encountered, and that you kept your books in a state of criminal disorder." A pause. "She also said you stood up for her in a room full of men who had decided not to." He didn't say anything. "She didn't have many people who did that," Margaret said more quietly. "Stand up for her when they didn't have to." She looked at him. "Don't stop." "I don't plan on it," he said. Margaret gave him a single nod, the kind that meant she was going to hold him to it, and went to find Evelyn, and Gideon watched the 2 of them together for a moment, Evelyn's careful posture and Margaret's animated one, the ease between them that came from years of real friendship, and felt, in an uncomplicated way that was still new enough to be notable, grateful. The world does not accommodate transformations without resistance. That was the thing Gideon learned in the years that followed, not as a lesson that arrived cleanly, but as a thing he understood slowly from living inside it. The estate's restructuring held, but required Evelyn's sustained attention in ways that took time and energy he could see costing her, the particular fatigue of fighting battles that should have been already won. Hargrove retired eventually and was replaced by a younger partner who was better, which helped. Margaret managed the Boston end with a precision that Evelyn paid for generously and that Margaret accepted without the pretense that it was charity rather than work, which was exactly the right arrangement for both of them. The ranch grew in the years after 1879 in the way that things grew when they had both money and knowledge. Not explosively, not overnight, but steadily and with a durability that came from being built correctly rather than built fast. The cattle operation expanded. Gideon hired 2 hands in 1880 and 4 more by 1883, men he chose for competence rather than cheapness, which Evelyn had persuaded him was the more efficient long-term calculation and which proved correct. She was involved in everything and made no secret of it, which continued to sit poorly with certain people in Blackstone Ridge and continued not to be her problem. She did the books. She negotiated supply contracts. She knew every animal in the herd by condition, if not by name, and had strong opinions about the quality of feed that she expressed directly to suppliers who discovered she was not a woman who could be managed with flattery or overcharged with impunity. The things she did beyond the ranch were her own decisions, made without asking permission, which was the only way she knew how to do anything. The first well was her idea. In the summer of 1880, the drought that had been threatening the region for 2 years arrived fully. 3 neighboring operations had their water sources dropped to critically low levels within a 6-week period. One of them was the Rowell Ranch, Hank's land, which shared the same underground water table as the Vance property and which was now in serious trouble. Evelyn rode over to the Rowell Ranch on a Tuesday morning without telling Gideon she was going, which was a thing she sometimes did when she'd already made a decision and didn't want to have the argument before executing it. She came back in the afternoon and sat down at the kitchen table and told him she was going to fund a communal well on the boundary between the 2 properties, deep enough to reach the lower water table that the drought couldn't touch. "Hank won't take charity," Gideon said. "I know. I'm not offering it as charity. I'm offering it as a shared infrastructure investment. His land benefits, our land benefits. The well belongs to both operations in proportion to the contribution. His contribution is the land access and the labor. Mine is the capital." He looked at her. "You already told him this." "I told him I had an idea and I needed to know if he was open to it before I came home and argued about it with you." He almost smiled. "You used me as a negotiating tool." "I told him my husband would need some convincing, which made him feel better about the whole thing because it meant he wasn't the only one with reservations, and by the time he finished worrying about you, he'd talked himself into it." She looked back at him steadily. He's a proud man who needed to not be the only one being helped. It was, Gideon thought, an absolutely precise piece of reading. "How deep does it need to go?" he said. "I have an estimate. There's a man in the county who does this work." "How much?" She told him. It was significant but manageable. "All right," he said. The well was built that September. It served both operations through 2 subsequent droughts over the following decade, and when a 3rd neighboring ranch, the Pelter family, who had struggled since the early days and nearly sold out twice, asked if they could access it in exchange for labor contribution, Evelyn said yes before Hank finished asking. That was how it started. That was the specific mechanism. Not a grand plan, not a designed philanthropy, just the practical logic of a woman who understood that survival in a difficult place was a communal problem that needed communal solutions, applied one decision at a time. The reading room came 2 years later, in 1882. The idea came from an unlikely source, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Thomas, 19 years old, originally from Kentucky, who had been working for them since 1881, and who Evelyn had noticed was functionally illiterate in a way he'd become skilled at hiding. She noticed because she noticed everything, and because hiding something from Evelyn Vance required a level of concealment that most people didn't have. She didn't make a scene of it. She didn't announce it or make Thomas feel the shame that the situation had already given him plenty of opportunity to acquire. She simply started, in the evenings, leaving a particular book on the kitchen table where he had access to it. A primer, worn but intact, the kind used for children but useful for adults in a way that didn't announce itself as such. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. One evening, she sat down beside him at the table, and they worked through several pages together without any formal acknowledgement that this was what they were doing. Thomas could read at a basic level by winter, but the conversation had opened between Evelyn and Gideon that fall, about Thomas, about the other hands, about the children she'd seen in Blackstone Ridge, who had no school and no books and no particular path to either. That conversation didn't close. "There are 12 children in this county without any regular instruction," she said one evening. I counted. "There's no teacher. There's no space, primarily. And no books. A teacher can be found if there's a space in books." He looked at her. "You've already thought about where." "There's a building on the east side of Maine that's been empty since the leather goods shop closed. The owner wants to sell it for back taxes. The back taxes are $400. She said it evenly, watching him. "It's a lot of money." "It's a lot of money. It would make a reading room. With proper shelving and a good lamp and a regular stock of books, it would serve the whole county." She paused. "I believe in paying for things that last." He sat with that for a moment. $400 for a reading room, he said. And the books, which I've been pricing out. She slid a piece of paper across the table. He looked at it without surprise, but of course she'd been pricing them out. Does it have to be called a reading room? He said. What would you call it? He thought. A library sounds too grand for Blackstone Ridge. A reading room sounds exactly right for Blackstone Ridge. He looked at the numbers on her paper. He looked at her face, which was doing the thing it did when she'd already decided but was giving him the courtesy of the conversation. All right, he said. The Blackstone Ridge. Free Reading Room opened in March of 1883 in the building on the east side of Main Street, with 243 books on shelves that Gideon built himself over the course of 2 weekends. Evelyn had found a woman named Celeste Bright, 32, originally from Illinois, who had teaching experience and was willing to take on the management of the room in exchange for a salary that Evelyn paid from the estate accounts without making an announcement about it. The opening was attended by 31 people, which was nearly a tenth of the county's total population. 12 of them were children. Nora Pruitt, who had been the first person in Blackstone Ridge to suspect something was unusual about Evelyn, stood at the back of the room and looked at the shelves, and then at Evelyn, and said, I owe you something of an apology, I think. Evelyn looked at her. You were doing what you thought was right for your community. I was doing what Mercer told me looked suspicious. Sometimes those are the same thing. Evelyn paused. I didn't hold it against you. Nora made the expression of a woman swallowing something that didn't go down easily. I should have been smarter. We all have things we should have been smarter about, Evelyn said. I have a whole list. That was, Gideon thought later, as close to grace as he'd ever seen the business of human error handled. Not performed forgiveness, not saintly generosity, just a practical recognition that people were what they were, and most of them were trying in the crooked way that trying usually looked. Dale Mercer left Blackstone Ridge in the spring of 1883 for reasons that were described publicly as a business opportunity in San Angelo, but that everyone in town understood were more accurately described as an exit from a situation that had stopped working in his favor. His store passed to his assistant, a young man named Fredericks, who turned out to be scrupulously honest about pricing, which Gideon noted with a dry satisfaction he didn't entirely try to hide. Evelyn didn't comment on Mercer's departure. She had characteristically already moved on to the next thing. The hardest year was 1885. It came after a run of good years, 2 strong cattle seasons, the reading room thriving, the wells holding through another dry summer. The good years had a way of making you forget that the land didn't owe you anything, that everything you'd built was in conversation with forces that didn't take your investment into consideration. The fever came through in July. It moved through the county the way illness moved through a place with limited medical resources and the particular density of a ranch community where people shared water and air and the close proximity of mutual survival. 3 children died in 6 weeks. One of them was the daughter of a ranch hand who'd worked for them since 1882, a man named Samuel whose wife had died 2 years before, leaving him with 4 children and the kind of grief that had nowhere to land in a working life. Samuel's daughter was 6 years old. Her name was Iris. Evelyn sat with her in the last days. She wasn't a doctor and couldn't do what a doctor could have done, which was the thing that stayed with her long after, the specific helplessness of having resources that couldn't reach what needed reaching. Money couldn't buy a doctor fast enough in a county with 1 medical man spread across too many miles. After the fever season ended, she wrote 3 letters. One to the county government requesting information on the process for establishing a medical fund. One to a physician in Dallas asking about his willingness to consider a rural practice with a guaranteed salary. One to Margaret Hollis asking for names of anyone she knew involved in rural medical access, which was a concern Margaret had been following in her own reading. Gideon found the letters on the desk one evening and read the addresses without reading the contents. He looked at her when she came in from outside. We can't save everyone, he said. He didn't mean it as an argument. He meant it as a thing he needed her to hear, because he'd seen the way the last 6 weeks had sat on her. I know that, she said. She sat down across from him. Her face was tired in a way it didn't usually show. I know we can't, but there are things that are within range of being fixed that aren't being fixed because no one with the means to fix them has decided to. And you've decided to. I'm going to try. She looked at him steadily. I know it might not work. I know it'll cost money that could go other places. I know some people in this town will have opinions about whether it's my place to... Evelyn. He said it to stop her, not to stop what she was describing. I wasn't arguing. She looked at him. Something in her face eased. I know, she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that for a while without talking, the way they sometimes sat now. Not the loaded silence of two strangers in October, not the careful quiet of two people figuring out the terms of proximity, but the settled, inhabited quiet of two people who had gotten to a place together and knew it. The County Medical Fund was established in 1886. It wasn't perfect. Nothing they built was perfect. And it was underfunded in its first year and required renegotiation and several heated conversations with county officials who had opinions about who should be directing such things. But by 1887, there was a doctor named Elias Crawford in a small practice building on the edge of Blackstone Ridge, who was paid a guaranteed minimum from the fund with the ability to earn above it through practice, and who turned out to be a solid man of 30 who'd grown up in rural Ohio and understood what it was to need a doctor and not have access to one. Dr. Crawford stayed for 14 years. He delivered several babies during that time, including, in the autumn of 1887, a boy that Evelyn named James, after her father, and who arrived in the world at approximately 4 a.m. with a stubbornness about the proceedings that Dr. Crawford said he'd never quite encountered before and that Gideon recognized immediately as familiar. James Vance was not an easy child. He was curious and impatient and physically fearless in a way that caused specific problems on a working ranch. And he had his mother's way of looking at things, the assessing stillness, the inventory expression, combined with his father's particular stubbornness, which produced a combination that was alternately impressive and exhausting. He could read at 4. He was attempting to help repair fence at 5 with mixed results. He asked questions about everything and expected real answers, and when he didn't get them, he went and found them himself, which was both admirable and frequently dangerous. Evelyn taught him accounts at the kitchen table starting when he was 6, the same table where she'd first opened Gideon's disastrous ledger 7 years earlier. Gideon taught him cattle and land and the specific practical knowledge of keeping a working ranch alive, the knowledge that couldn't be learned from books, the knowledge that lived in the hands and the feet and the back. They argued about him sometimes, the way parents argued about children, not with real anger, but with the friction that came from two people who had strong individual views on most things, trying to coordinate on a third person who had strong individual views on everything. Evelyn thought he needed more formal instruction than the ranch provided. Gideon thought formal instruction without the land underneath it produced men who could think but couldn't act. They were both right, and they both knew it, which made the argument circular in the way the most honest arguments were. There was a second child, a girl, in 1890. They named her Clara, which was Gideon's suggestion, offered quietly one evening and received with a look from Evelyn that he couldn't entirely read except to know it was not a small look. Clara was different from James in every way. Quieter, observant, with a tendency to sit in corners and watch things before joining them, that was so specifically her mother that it stopped Gideon's heart sometimes to see it in a small child's face. She was the one who showed up at the reading room at the age of 3 and walked directly to the shelves and stood looking up at them with an expression of such focused longing that Celeste Bright sat down on the floor beside her and spent the next hour reading to her from a picture book. After that, Clara basically lived in the reading room. Evelyn considered this outcome a complete success. The years moved the way years moved when they were full, quickly from a distance, slowly when you were in them. The ranch became what it eventually became through the accumulation of work and decision and mistake and correction, which was how anything real was built. They lost cattle in a bad winter in 1891 and recovered. A fence dispute with a neighboring operation in 1892 went to arbitration and was resolved in their favor because Evelyn had kept every document related to that boundary line since 1880, and Gideon had not known she was doing this, and experienced the resulting legal outcome with a respect he didn't know how to fully articulate. The wells had been expanded by then, serving 5 operations. The reading room had evolved into something that more closely resembled a proper library, with over 800 volumes and a second room added in 1889. Celeste Bright had trained a younger woman to help her, and was, by the mid-1890s, a fixture of the county in the way that indispensable things became fixtures, present so consistently and usefully that people forgot to notice them. Blackstone Ridge did not become a different place. That was the thing Gideon understood, and that Evelyn had never pretended otherwise. Small frontier towns were what they were. Practical, sometimes small-minded, resistant to change in the specific way that communities were resistant when survival required continuity and continuity punished deviation. There were still people in the county who had opinions about Evelyn's role, her money, her willingness to act in ways that didn't fit the expected dimensions of a rancher's wife in 1880s West Texas. She gave those opinions the same attention she gave weather that was inconvenient but not catastrophic. She noted it, she worked around it, and she moved on. What changed was smaller and more durable than the town itself. It was the specific texture of what was possible for the people in it. Children who had no books had books. Ranchers whose water was failing had access to water. Families who had no medical care had a doctor they could reach. These were not revolutionary changes. They were the kind of changes that didn't get recorded as events, but showed up decades later in the difference between what survived and what didn't. Gideon thought about this sometimes. In the evenings, when the ranch was quiet and the lamp was low, and whatever they'd built together was all around him in the only way you could really see something, which was from inside it. He thought about the man who had placed a 43-cent advertisement in the fall of 1879 and described what he wanted in terms so stripped of sentiment that it had sounded like a notice for livestock. He had gotten what he asked for. He had also gotten considerably more, which was not what he'd asked for, and turned out to be the only thing that had mattered. The practical arrangement he'd proposed, a capable woman, no complications, had delivered the most complicated woman he'd ever encountered, and the complications had saved everything. His land, his books, his water, his sense of what was possible, the specific shape of a future he hadn't known he still wanted until she arrived and made the wanting possible again. He was not a man who said things like this out loud. He was who he'd always been. Direct, economical with words, more fluent in action than in declaration. But Evelyn had learned to read him the way she read numbers, not for what was stated, but for what the pattern revealed. And he had learned to let himself be read, which was different from letting himself be known in the way he used to understand it. It was more honest and more uncomfortable and better in every way that mattered. On a spring evening in 1895, 16 years after the train pulled into Blackstone Ridge, with a woman who carried one bag and a secret worth $340,000, Gideon was on the porch when Evelyn came out and sat down beside him, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the light was good and the work had reached a natural pause. James was somewhere on the North Range, 18 years old, and already managing a section of the operation with the focused competence that neither of them was surprised by, but both of them were proud of in the quiet way they were proud of things. Clara was inside, probably reading, definitely reading, had been reading since she could walk and showed no signs of stopping. The land spread out in front of them in the long spring light, the pastures greener than they'd been in October of 1879, the result of the wells and the work and 16 years of knowing what the soil needed and providing it. The north well was holding steady. The cattle count was 3 times what it had been. The south side of the barn, the board she'd helped him replace in March of 1880, had been replaced again since then with better material, and the whole structure looked like something built to last. "Hargrove's firm closed," she said. Not preamble, just information, the way she always delivered things. "When?" "Last year. I heard from Margaret. He retired, and the remaining partners couldn't hold it together without him." A pause. "I'm not sorry." "No," he said. The light moved across the land in the long, slow way of spring evenings. Somewhere in the direction of the Rowell Ranch, something was moving. Probably Hank's cattle, probably fine. "I got a letter from the County Historical Society," she said. "They want to document the reading room's founding for their records." "What did you tell them?" "I haven't answered yet." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't particularly want to be documented." He looked at her. She was looking at the land, and her face had the expression he knew best and valued most. Not the careful, contained expression of the woman who'd stepped off the train in October, managing her exposure, keeping herself in reserve. This was something else. The face she wore when she wasn't managing anything. Present. Settled. Here. "Then don't," he said. The work should be documented even if I shouldn't be. Write them about the work and leave yourself out of it. She considered this. They'll find out anyway. Let them find out. You don't have to hand it to them. She almost smiled, the corner of her mouth. You've gotten better at that, she said. At what? Telling me what I actually need to hear instead of what you think I want to hear. He looked back at the land. It took practice. She laughed. It was the real laugh, not the brief one he'd heard occasionally over the years, but the full version, low, a little rough, genuinely surprised out of her the way a real laugh usually was. It was not a sound she made often, and he never got used to it. They sat on the porch until the light was gone. James came in from the North Range, dusty and direct, reporting on the section with the efficiency of a young man who had grown up watching two people communicate in practical specifics and had absorbed the style completely. Clara appeared from inside long enough to eat supper and disappeared back into whatever she was reading with the same single-minded focus she'd been born with. The house was full and loud and imperfect and entirely real, and none of it had been in the 43-cent advertisement that had started it, which was the thing about life that kept insisting on making itself clear regardless of how carefully you planned, that what you asked for and what you needed were usually different things, and the distance between them was where everything worth having actually lived. Gideon washed up after supper and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet that came after the household settled, the particular quiet of a house that was occupied and resting rather than empty and waiting. He could hear Evelyn in the main room, the familiar sound of her at the desk. Writing something. Always writing something. Correspondence, records, the accumulated documentation of a life that had touched more things than she'd ever intended when she stepped off a train in October of 1879 with a single bag and a name she wasn't fully using. He stood in the kitchen a moment longer. Then he went in and sat down across from her. The same table they'd sat at 1,000 times, in the same 2 chairs, in the same house that had been dying when she arrived and wasn't anymore. She looked up. "Coffee?" she said. "Sure," he said. She got up and made it, and he sat at the table in his house, on his land, in the life that had been salvaged from its own wreckage by a woman who had arrived with nothing and given the whole of herself anyway. That was the thing nobody in Blackstone Ridge had understood at the beginning. The town had seen the money eventually and decided that was the story. The fortune that changed the frontier, the railroad heiress who built the wells and the library and funded the doctor. And those things were true, all of them. But the money had always been there. The money had existed in Boston for 5 years before she'd spent a cent of it in West Texas. Money alone did not build the wells or the reading room or the medical fund. Those had required something else, something that was not in any ledger. It required a woman who had chosen, deliberately, to be somewhere, not to pass through, not to manage from a distance, not to write checks, and preserve herself from the difficulty of actual contact with the actual lives she was trying to make easier. She had fixed the fence herself, with bleeding hands, at 4 a.m. She had sat up all night with sick cattle. She had stood in a bank in February and put documentation on a table and looked a man in the eye and told the truth about who she was and what she had and what she was going to do with it. She had answered a 43-cent advertisement in the Frontier Companion because she needed to know if the world contained a man who would choose her when she had nothing, and she had found out that it did, and she had stayed. That was the story, not the money. The well they built together, the first one, on the boundary between the Vance and Rowell land, was still standing in 1895 and would still be standing in 1910 and 1920 and into decades that neither of them would live to see. It stood the way things stood when they were built by people who understood what they were building and why, with the specific durability that came from meaning it. Long after both of them were gone, people in what had once been Blackstone Ridge and had grown by then into something larger and less hard still told the story beside that well. The way stories survived that had something true in them beyond the facts, some arrangement of human experience that kept making sense to people regardless of when they heard it. A lonely rancher ordered a woman with nothing. The woman who arrived gave the whole frontier its future. But what the story never quite captured, what Gideon, if he'd been a different kind of man, might have said out loud, might have wanted recorded, was the smaller thing inside the larger one. She gave the frontier its future. She gave him back his. And those two things, in the end, were the same act.